It's my pleasure to introduce our fifth finalist, C Coston. He's coming to us from Dickinson State University, and he's going to give us a 20-25 minutes presentation, and then we're going to go into a question and answering. So let's welcome DC.
Good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here and want to say thank you to NALU, the search committee, for the invitation to come spend some time actually on your campus and visiting with you. I was attracted to this position for several reasons, one of which is most of my career has been spent in institutions of a complexity and size much more similar to yours than the institution where I currently am. And I thoroughly enjoyed the mix of the types of activities and programs you have, including the graduate and growing research programs as well as outstanding undergraduate programs, the outreach to communities, to businesses, and the type of service you do. And then the second reason is that as you look at many institutions of higher ed, they try to be all things to all people. You're clearly defining yourself as the Polytechnic institution in Wisconsin is an incredibly compelling thing, and I think something on which you have already built a great reputation and have the chance to build and grow much into the future. The title I was given, and I assume the others with whom you have visited, was called Building Bridges. I find this a fascinating topic in one sense because a dear friend of mine who I've gotten to know over the last several years, Mel Nelson, works with a number of organizations and wrote a book. Is that a tribute to Mel? Anyway, he's a great guy. Anyway, he wrote a book about organizations and using the building of organizations to bridges, and the title of the book is Building Bridges. And Mel actually had me be one of the reviewers and editors on it before he published the book, so he and I have had quite a number of conversations. And I want to use a bit of the metaphor that he uses to lay a groundwork for the comments I'll make and then the conversation that hopefully we'll have over the next hour or so. Mel talks about how he and his family, a number of years ago on a family vacation, crossed the Mackinac Bridge. And I assume most of you have crossed the Mackinac Bridge or have seen it, or at least have seen major suspension bridges. And the Mackinac Bridge did a number of amazing things, but one of the things it did in that 26,000-foot span is reduce what had typically been a 19-hour process of waiting for a ferry and so on, to where now it's 5 to 7 minutes, a rather dramatic change. And Mel draws a metaphor from the pieces of that to organizations and how organizations come together. There are four major components of one of those bridges. I assume all of you can imagine what we normally see are the cables and the suspension, but there's some other things that make it work. One of the pieces you probably haven't seen too much or paid too much to are what are called the cable anchorages. They're at the two ends where the cables are actually tied to those, and they end up bearing the majority of the weight of that bridge or any suspension bridge. The Mackinac Bridge weighs slightly over 1 million tons, and the cable anchorages make up 35% of the total weight of that bridge. Make up 35%. In Mel's model, the cable anchorages represent the core values and core purpose of the organization. Some of you that have read my materials or the letter know that for the last couple of years I've taught a class in leadership for a number of our students. And we use the books Good to Great by Jim Collins and the parallel book Built to Last by Collins and Porras. And they talk about one of the major understandings or findings they had, particularly in Built to Last, of organizations that performed at an incredibly high level over a long, long period of time, was that there is a defined set of core values that are immutable. Basically, they don't change. There's no magic set, but any organization has its values. They're quite often not talked about, but everybody who's part of that organization understands those. And in an organization that's working well, they serve as the basis for all the decisions, all the things that are done. An interesting exercise I did in my class last year, in team projects, I had them talk about the future of the institution where I am. And I asked them to say, what are the core values of the university where I am today? And it was interesting. They defined those as integrity, access, excellence, and innovation and inquiry. And I took that set and I started going around and visiting with faculty and other students and staff and alumni, and everyone with whom I spoke said they got it right. And so now, as we're in the midst of our 10-year reaccreditation process, that has become a part, and we've actually posted those on some walls in some places. And it was interesting that a group of students from their experience had perceived that. I would ask you, what are those core values and that core purpose of University of Wisconsin Stout? So the cable anchorages, those end pieces, are 35% of the weight of that bridge, and everything is dependent on the functioning of those, or in this model, the values of the organization. A part that you do see a significant piece of are the towers, the two large towers that hold the cables up at the top. You have the towers and the footings under them. They represent about 32% of the weight of that bridge. And in Mel's model, those are the relationships built on integrity and trustworthiness among people who are part of the organization and with the people you serve in so many ways, whether it be your students, the communities, and folks you serve. So it's the towers and footings, those relationships built on integrity and trustworthiness. What's interesting is, of the total weight of that bridge, that more than 1 million tons, 65% of the total weight of that bridge is below the water. You never see it. And it is that set of core values, it is that set of relationships built on ongoing trustworthiness, communications, integrity, and so on, that are there, that everyone counts on and are part of what is occurring. The third piece of the model are the suspension cables. Those suspension cables, you're very familiar with those. In the case of the Mackinac Bridge, those cables, each one is 24.5 inches in diameter. They're 41,000 feet, or 41,000 miles of steel wire in those cables. Those cables, each one is made up of 340 wires per strand. Each cable has 37 strands, total of 12,350 wires to make up those two large cables. It took 300 people working 2.5 months round the clock to string that wire. And in Mel's model, the cables represent leadership and are the leadership of the organization. So it is with leadership in an organization, just like it is with that bridge. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not a one-time event, it's an ongoing commitment. And that leadership, while absolutely vital, in the case of that bridge, is 1% of that bridge's weight. As my dear friend Mel often says to me when he's giving me a checkup, if there were a Centers for Disease Control for executive leadership or for executive suites, probably the #1 pandemic would be narcissism. Mel serves as a wonderful conscience. But it is an interesting thing, and I hope some of you have read those books to which I referred. It's covered in both of those what those two phenomenal research studies showed about leadership of organizations that grew to incredible levels of performance, but also stayed at those levels of performance for a long, long time. In Good to Great, they really fully developed the concept. They called it level 5 leaders, and those folks are incredibly rare. But if you go through and read that, they are not, those top leaders were not the folks that have had their pictures on the front page of Forbes or Business Week or Fortune magazine. Most of them, they're the names that are not in anybody's business hall of fame or whatever. But they were incredible leaders, and they were characterized by two primary qualities that they found person after person. One is a deep sense of humility, a recognition that it is the organization that does the work and makes things happen, but also an absolute unrelenting commitment to improving the organization and an unrelenting drive that organization be successful. So I think Mel's comment about narcissism, it can be, for many folks, quite intoxicating to be in those types of positions and to end up in challenging places. A wonderful piece of the leadership piece, and it is something that I've grown to understand, but it's something that I would challenge each of you to think about. As I have taught the class the last couple of years, I've had external folks come in and speak to them. One of the folks I've had come is a gentleman named Jeff Kaufman. Grew up in northeastern Montana, literally in a family of great poverty. The institution where I am reached out, gave him an opportunity, primarily through athletic scholarships, to come to school, but it also taught him a number of things. Jeff went on to join Allstate Insurance, and about 3 years ago retired as one of the top 10 executives in Allstate Insurance. Jeff, at the time he retired, was responsible for 35,000 staff. Jeff's forte was going out into troubled parts of that great company and helping restore the culture and trust and so forth. Jeff, as he comes and speaks with my class and then to a community leadership group that we've put together, has a list of principles of leadership he's talked about. One of those, the first one goes back to what we talked about earlier, that it's based on integrity and trustworthiness. But another one of his is called leverage your fishbowl. Leverage your fishbowl. Each one of us sometimes doesn't understand that there are people constantly watching us, whether it's our students, whether it's our fellow staff, faculty, others within the institution, whether it's people in the community. Leverage your fishbowl and always understand that you're representing yourself and all your colleagues. So these first three elements, the cable anchorages, the towers and footings, and the suspension cables, representing values, relationships, and leadership, are all vital and must be in great shape as you begin to talk about the fourth part, which is the bridge decking and the part that you actually drive on. And in Mel's model, that bridge decking is the strategy. It's where you're going. As you look in the built to last concept, and they start talking about the yin and yang that they came out with from the organizations they studied, everything built on a set of immutable core values, and then you're constantly innovating on everything else as part of your strategy. They talk in terms that what you need to do is talk about building a clock, not telling time. Building a clock, not telling time. So building an organization. One of the great examples they talk about is the formation of the Hewlett-Packard company that those two fellows got together while they were students at Stanford, came out And their first goal was to create a company, and then they spent about 8 or 10 months figuring out the first thing they would make. And if you go into Hewlett-Packard, it's built on an organization that is constantly learning, constantly improving, and has been part of the core ethic of that for a long, long time. In these two books, if you have looked at them, the concept in the good to great is what they call, that companies find what they call the hedgehog concept, or human organization. And the hedgehog concept, you look at essentially a Venn diagram where the three circles come together. The three circles are what can you be the best in the world at? The second circle, what are you passionate about? And what drives your economic engine? And where those three come together, you have what's called the hedgehog concept. And they give a number of examples. In Built to Last, they talked about what's called the big, hairy, audacious goal. And I expect most of you, it kind of got out into popular literature and popular speak as a BHAG, and people didn't take time to read the depth of what it means. It talks about where you really kind of stake the future and bet things. And for people within the organization, it's absolutely logical and makes perfect sense. And for many people on the outside, people are scratching their head going, how can this possibly happen? One of the ones they talked about was when Boeing decided to build the 747, and everybody else was saying it was impossible, and they essentially bet the whole thing. As I look at the history of your organization and this wonderful institution, I would say in one sense kind of the core purpose since the founding with Mr. Stout is that you've been about building the economy and society, and concurrently with that, preparing people to lead those things as they go forward. So helping create the future and then preparing the people to lead that future. As you look at what happened in your early days with the formation of the institution, and as we start thinking about hedgehog concepts and big, hairy, audacious goals, you've taken on some. It had to be a rather interesting time when this institution became part of the University of Wisconsin system. That had to be a moment in time. This institution's aspiring to and being awarded a Baldrige Award is something incredible. I had the chance, and those of you who have seen my materials, I had the chance to go through the programs with a couple of companies that won Baldrige Awards. The transformation and what that means and the commitment is phenomenal. For an institution to make that development and move there was tremendous. That was a huge goal. You're seeking and getting the approval to be able to be called the Polytechnic University of Wisconsin was a huge undertaking. And you made a great commitment in that and are well on the way with that. The interesting question would be, what's next? And were I to come, I would look forward to engaging with you to try to discover what is next. So we've looked a bit at this analogy, Mel's analogy of the bridge, much of it not seen, but things that we understand, the cable anchorages, the towers and footings, the suspension cables, the spans representing values, relationships based on integrity and trustworthiness, the leadership and executive conduct, and then finally the strategy and team engagement. This bridge analogy, I think, is a wonderful thing and goes in many, many directions within and external to the organization, and I hope as we had a chance for interaction, we will talk more about that. All of us, every one of us, including quite a number of you, I expect, coming to this institution today, but every one of us at one time or another have entrusted our futures, our very lives, to a bridge. A bridge joins here with there. It joins now with when. It joins today with tomorrow. It motivates us, in many cases, to move from where we are to where we want to go. It joins the present to the future, and it provides for transition, a path from what was to what will be. And just as the bridge builder had to think, and it's something I would challenge all of us to think about, the bridge builder actually crossed the bridge in his or her mind long before that bridge was built. It's up to all of us to be building those bridges. In the words of the Nobel laureate Albert Schintz Georgi, who for those of you in science realms, discovered the tricarboxylic acid cycle, the TCA cycle, and did some other things, was a Nobel Prize laureate. His comment was, and it applies here, to see what everyone else has seen and to think what no one else has thought. Let me just close with a couple of stories that I sometimes use. And one of them particularly relevant, I think, in institutions of higher education. I was fortunate enough, as many people across the country, to go to one of the Harvard Institution for Educational Leadership programs a number of years ago. And one of the speakers during that was Art Levine, who was on the graduate education faculty at Harvard at that point, went on to be president of a couple of colleges and was quite well known. He closed out a day's worth of case studies and intensive stuff with us. And he said, "There's one more thing I want to say to you." His comment was, some of the things you do truly make a difference. The challenge is when you're doing them, you don't know which ones they are. So you must do all of them incredibly well. About 3 years ago, one morning I walked in, signed on to email, and there was a name on a message that I didn't quite recognize. And it was a student that I had taught more than 20 years earlier. She had also been one of my undergraduate advisees, had gone on to have a very successful life. And in this message, she started talking about the specific points in conversations we had while she was a student. I didn't remember those conversations. I certainly remembered her. She had gotten married and was using her married name, so I didn't recognize the name initially. But I certainly recognize that. But it's an interesting thing. We all build bridges in incredible ways. Some of the things you do make a difference. You just don't know which ones they are, so you have to do them all incredibly well. Another story I like to use, and it's a challenge that I've used for myself and for other folks. Many of you know I went to undergraduate school at North Carolina State and had a good friend there named Bill Barrett who graduated a couple of years prior to me. Bill majored in mechanical engineering. His lifetime dream up to that point had been to work in the automobile industry, and he managed to get a job as a test engineer with Ford Motor Company in Dearborn immediately out of college. Well, fast forward 2 years, I finished my undergraduate work, went to grad school at Michigan State, so I called Bill up and said, "Hey, let's get together." Went down to see him. And we did the all catching up on everybody you know sort of stuff. And then I said, "So how are things at Ford?" And he started talking to me. This was on a Saturday, and he said, 2 days ago, we went on the assembly line, and we pulled 2 Ford Torinos. I'm dating myself. Some of you remember Torinos. We pulled 2 Ford Torinos off the line, back to back, that were supposed to be identical. Same drivetrain, same color, everything was supposed to be identical. And he said, "You need to know that Ford has been has gotten to where they make body parts for cars to a tolerance of plus or minus 1 inch." He said, "You know how you," and some of you will relate. You remember how you used to get a car, and once you got above about 40, 45 miles an hour, there was always a whistle around the windows? They had a person that looked at how the door fit and had that weather stripping, that gasket, in increments of a quarter inch, from a quarter inch to an inch and a quarter, and had to pick the one that looked like it fit and put in there. That's part of why you had that whistle. It didn't always fit, and those of you that remember blowing across the top of a Coke bottle or soft drink bottle in the whistle, it was the same thing. Bill said they took those two automobiles, were supposed to be identical, to the test track, and there was 6 inches difference in the length of those automobiles. Folks, in those days, the words Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Kia, Hyundai were not part of the language of the United States. The United States had become a bit complacent on some things. Coming out of World War II was clearly the dominant, and had become complacent. We must not become complacent. The phrase that Bill used to me that day, and I used with my students last year and this year, and it was amazing, the papers I got Monday night of this week as their final paper, as they wrote about themselves personally. One of the greatest lessons they took away from the class was using that story. And that phrase is, good enough is not good enough. Good enough is not good enough. Let me finish with one final set of comments. I hope many of you know who W. Edwards Deming was. Certainly, as this institution went through the Baldrige situation, you would have run into Deming. He was a statistician by training. Developed many of the concepts of statistical process control that are used in manufacturing. Was plucked out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the late 1930s and put with the planning for the development of the industrial base in the United States as the anticipation for World War II was emerging, and was given much of the credit for putting into place the quality programs and other things that helped the U.S. be able to execute that war fairly quickly. Following the war, he was part of the Marshall Plan, went to Japan and helped much of the transformation of Japanese industry. Came back, and I'm sure many of you remember, and it's interesting to tie it back to the story about Bill Barrett, but there was a period of time when the phrase for Ford was quality is job one. That was when Deming came back and Ford engaged him to help them. I had the opportunity when Dr. Deming was 93 years old to go to one of his seminars. About 700 people in the room, and for 4 days he held forth. An amazing thing. He had a sense. But he got to the point in that program where he had talked about all the things related to statistical process control and those things, and then he talked about the importance of human relationships and other things. But what was interesting, he closed out almost every session with a comment. He just looked across the room, and his comment was, those that are the strongest have the greatest responsibility to get better. My read is that you're an incredibly strong institution. You're well poised for the future. Yes, you've got some challenges that you need to face, but it's an opportunity to grow. It's an opportunity to look for that new big, hairy, audacious goal, or however you might want to do it. A sense of built on a set of core values. Were I to come, I would hope to help develop relationships with you, with me, but certainly among all of you and the organizations you study, or you work with, excuse me, and then to develop strategies that are constantly innovative and that indeed are continue that long-standing tradition of helping push forward society and the economy and preparing people to lead that throughout their lives. I thank you for the opportunity to be here and now stand ready for some conversations. So thank you.